Have you noticed something? The last few years have been a seismic shift, and people aren't as afraid or naive as they used to be about how the world truly works. And there's a healthy level of cynicism now that didn't exist before. I think this conversation between Jordan Peterson and Canadian Conservative politician Eric Duhaime reveals just how afraid the ruling elites are at this public awakening.
Everywhere I go in the world, if I make a case for the nexus, let's say, between suffering, which is inevitable, and the meaning that emerges out of the voluntary adoption of responsibility, everyone falls silent. And that happens all the time. And my sense of that is, and this is part of the reason why I think there's a conservative opportunity that's beckoning in a major way that you might be tapping into, is that what conservatives have to offer young people, and that's the first time I've ever seen this really be the case, is the meaningful existence that characterizes, it's so absurd that it has to be said, that characterizes genuine maturation and sacrifice on behalf of others. Like as a real viable pathway forward existentially and psychologically to have the kind of life that enables you to not be bitter in the face of catastrophe. And so now, it's a paradoxical thing, right? Because apparently what you're offering on the libertarian side is something like freedom from authoritarian constraint. That's an odd thing in some sense for a conservative to be offering. But do you see, why is it that what you're selling, so to speak, what you're promoting is resonating deeply among younger people in Quebec? And how do you conceptualize that from the perspective of the development, let's say, of a political vision, which is something that conservatives tend to struggle to do?
We have to understand that historically, because we were stuck in the old debate and the old constitutional fights and feuds, almost all the political parties in Quebec were more center-left. They were all social democrats, and we used to vote more liberal. It's always been, there was kind of a consensus on that side. And now that debate is over, there's a new one that is emerging. And of course, the fact that it's new and the fact that it's fresh and the fact that it's different is attracting already a younger crowd, because you're not scaring them off. They love change. But there's also the fact that I do believe that they're, because of the social media, because of the new world that we're in, they're much more open towards the world, if I could say so. And that's something, they want to be part of something also larger. And for that, you need a little bit more freedom, and you don't want to be just limited to Quebec. And with the state intervention, everything is limited to Quebec. Everything is, so there's a vision of looking outside of the box. I think that helps out a lot.
You know what's interesting? In Canada, for example, a character like Justin Trudeau in the last 8 years has not only failed to appeal to a young electorate, but done quite the opposite. There's been a disillusionment in Canada's youth as the good-looking and sweet-talking Justin Trudeau falls very short of the credentials they thought he stood for. Right now, the same young population that propelled him to the premiership may be the one to get him out, as polls suggest only around a quarter of the voter base below the age of 44 intend on voting Liberal. But remember one thing, whenever you see such a shift in the political tectonic plates, there's usually something deeper going on that needs to be explored. Simply put, a lot of the young people find themselves in a crisis of meaning and identity. In doing that, they're faced with the two options: pick a side, hold the placards, and start chanting for their rights. Or to look at the other side and adopt responsibility as a way to find that meaning. I think we may be seeing a time that young people aren't just that interested in being a victim, because they understand how the only person that would want them to be a victim is someone that wants them to be weak. And that ties into something else as well. I think we underestimate just how transformative the last few years have been, especially after the pandemic. Future historians will write how a seismic shift in people's mindset happened around this time, where an increasing percentage of the population just did not trust things like government, media, global organizations, celebrities, and corporations. That's backed up by the numbers, because statistics from Pew Research reveal how the graph for people's trust in governments looks like a downward slope over the last 2 decades. Right now, a mere 20% of people's trust the government to do the right thing most of the time. That's not a kind of population that's easy to control for people in positions of power.
The fact also, and I'm back to what happened over the last 2 years, who suffered the most during those days? You and I probably, are curfew at 8 or 9 p.m. It's not the end of the world. But if I were 20, if I recall what I was doing after 9 p.m. when I was 20, the impact was much larger on me. And I think they took much more than seniors. They realized how the state could, ruin your life at a certain extent when they're pushing the envelope a little bit too far. And so that woke up a lot of people who were completely apolitical. It's not necessarily people coming from other parties that are joining us. It's people who used to not even vote, and now they're card-carrying members and they're volunteers on our campaigns or even running for us. So there's something very, very different. The paradigm also has shifted on that side, and it's for many of us, we realize that politics could intervene a lot in our life, and that's why we're standing up to say, look, stay out of it. There's limits, and that's why even the slogan of our campaign is "Libre chez nous." We didn't know it. You can't translate that perfectly in English, but if we translate it word to word, it's free at home. And what it says is that there's limits. I want to have the control. You were talking about your family, your unit. So even our slogan refers to that. Like the state cannot cross my entrance door without my will. We want to go back to be empowered of what we're doing within our own houses, and that for a new generation is probably something that is more interesting.
Eric Duhaime himself was a vocal critic of Canada's response to the pandemic, with the stringent lockdowns and mandates that almost just followed the lead of what China was doing in haste. But there's an even more important event that woke people up to how fragile their rights truly were under Justin Trudeau, and that's the Freedom Convoy protests back in early 2022. The hasty invocation of the Emergencies Act and the temporary expansion of his powers to quell the truckers' protest was an event that jolted a lot of people to reality for what they should expect from Justin Trudeau. It wasn't a side of him that they had seen before, especially with the freezing of many of truckers' bank accounts that demonstrated just how entrenched his government's influence was as far down as the private banking sector. The federal court in Canada just earlier this year announced its decision against the move, calling it, quote, unreasonable and an unjustified infringement of individual rights. The whole point of the legal system, and especially the Constitution, is to make sure the federal government does not turn tyrannical or become outsized in its influence and interference in individual life. So it's at least encouraging that the fundamental state structure in Canada is still robust enough to withstand the shocks from a character like Justin Trudeau. But even apart from that, the tendency to abuse power to cement control and possible government overreach applies to the domain of free speech as well, because it's actually one of the first areas to be clamped down on. Canada does not have something as amazing as the First Amendment, and it has already set a dangerous precedent of compelled speech legislation with the passing of Bill C-16, but none of that is without its backlash, and in a world that is connected as it is, Canadians have the vital global contrast they need to finally wake up to where their country's headed.
Worldwide right now, we see that, our parents were more collectivist in many ways, like just when you were talking about the separatist movement. The separatist movement at the base was a collective movement. It was as francophones, as old French Canadians. It had something very collective. And nowadays, because of social media, we're a little bit more individualistic, I think, at many extent. And we are francophone, yes, we are Quebecers, but we're also part of all sorts of groups and all sorts of friends all over the world, and we unite based on different issues than just our language or our geographic limitations. So it also has an impact on your political reality when it's time to vote. So
you can imagine that. Okay, so Quebec was united in some sense on the French side under the Catholic Church, and then that fragmented, and then Quebec attempted to unite under the auspices of a collective nationalism. And then one of the consequences was that people were turning to a powerful and unified state as a vehicle for their dreams. And that meant that the state as it became the vehicle for those dreams, it also became more intrusive in the ways that would be associated with excess, let's say, pretensions of benevolence. And then you're making the case that the limitations of that approach became radically evident to young people when the state overplayed its hand in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic and locked them down way too hard. And that woke up a generation of young people to the dangers of the overweening state, even if that was allied with some desirable expression of nationalism and group identity. Does that seem about right?
Yeah, that's about how I feel it. Like that's what we saw over the last few months, the last few years here in Quebec. It happened elsewhere as well. We're not unique in the world where it did happen. And so from a sociological perspective, that's what you can observe right now.
Quebec is somewhat of a microcosm of the large amount of identity politics that defines much of the North American continent. But from questions around the French language in the province to an identity based on superficial characteristics, you see the strength of Quebec separatism start to wane as the newer generation phases out the old one in the voting base. The story of Canada in the last few years is of a population that is much less docile than it used to be. You see them rising up, protesting, asking the tough questions, and starting to compare where they stand versus the rest of the world, especially their southern neighbor. That means things have gotten a lot more difficult to control for any government in the country, since it's starting to face a much smarter and more demanding population. For the people that thought they could keep the status quo running as it did, that job has been made much harder as more and more people wake up and realize that it's time to be more cynical about how the world actually works.